In this video, I'd like to respond to something that was recently posted by Dan McClellan.
The Bible treats a fetus as property and not as a person. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And there's only one passage in all the Bible that actually directly addresses this question. And it's not Jeremiah 1:5. It's not Psalm 139. It's not Luke 1. None of these are addressing the personhood of a fetus. They're addressing God's foreknowledge. They're addressing God's oversight of gestation. They're addressing exceptional circumstances where things don't go the way they normally do. The only passage that actually addresses the personhood of a fetus is Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25, which is legislation that imposes penalties should two men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And there are two outcomes that are described. The first outcome is that the injury causes the woman to miscarry, in which case the husband imposes a fine of his choosing, and there is arbitration there so that it does not become exorbitant. The other outcome is permanent injury or death to the woman, in which case talionic justice is activated and the penalty is life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In other words, whatever happened to the woman, that is then done to the perpetrators. And what this indicates is that the woman was considered to be a legal and a moral person, and the fetus was not. The fetus was treated as property. And this perspective agrees with the view throughout the Hebrew Bible that breath was the necessary and sufficient feature of life. This agrees with early rabbinic discussion about when the fetus becomes a person. It's when either the head or the majority of the body, should the person be born in breech, leaves the birth canal. And this agrees with the mainstream of tradition with Judaism ever since then.
Dan here is giving us one way to interpret this text. It may even be the majority view among commentators. But it's by no means the only way, or even the most natural way to interpret the text, as Dan so confidently implies. In fact, there's another way to read the text which, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many commentators, is more exegetically defensible. Let's look at this text a bit more closely. A literal rendering would go something like this. And if men strive or fight, and they strike a pregnant woman, and her children go out, and there is no harm, a fine shall be imposed, according to what the woman's husband shall lay upon him. And he, speaking of the assailant, shall give as the judges determine. The Hebrew here is a little bit uncertain. And if there is harm, you shall render life for life. Notice first of all that the Hebrew text doesn't use the word fetus. That's because fetus, at least as most people would use it nowadays, is quite modern. In discussions that touch upon the status and rights of the unborn, it tends to be used a lot more by people who are trying to avoid any suggestion that the unborn actually qualify as human beings or as persons. Most other people simply refer to the unborn as a baby, and that's more or less what we find in the Hebrew text. Rather than coming up with some functional equivalent for fetus, the Hebrew text simply refers to the unborn as a yeled, which is best translated as child. The word is given here in the plural, possibly because it gives the law a wider application. You may have noticed that women can sometimes give birth to more than just one baby at a time. Now, in English, we might have expressed the same kind of sentiment by saying something like, and her child or children go out. Anyway, as Dan points out, the Septuagint interprets this text to mean that the death penalty should only be imposed upon the assailant if the child that has gone out from the woman is fully formed. The Septuagint uses the term ex equinismenon, which can apparently mean fully formed or something like that. But this reflects a viewpoint from later centuries that conform to Greek philosophical reflection on when life begins, as Dan himself has correctly stated in his video. No one follows the Septuagint rendering of this text in order to make sense of the Hebrew. So it's really only relevant to talk about the Septuagint if we want to show how the Hebrew text was interpreted by readers of a later generation who were operating under foreign, and I would say pagan, influences. Now, going back to this slide, the Hebrew text doesn't use the term miscarriage, as Dan suggests. There was no ancient Hebrew equivalent for that English term. And when a language doesn't have a specific term for something, people have to supply other words and phrases to indicate what they're talking about. We don't get that in this Hebrew text. There's really no indication, at least in verse 22, that what's being described is a miscarriage. This text explains what to do if two men are involved in a brawl and a pregnant woman somehow gets caught up in that brawl, sustains a blow, and then her children go out from her. In fact, we're not even told that there's a causal relationship between the woman being struck and the children going out from her. But given the context, it's probably reasonable to assume that the one is the cause of the other. According to Dan, the woman miscarries. In other words, she's induced to go into labor, and the children come out of her dead. But we're not told that they come out dead, at least not in verse 22. And Dan doesn't offer any reason as to why the grammar has to be construed in this way. He simply declares that this is what it means. But this is only an assumption on his part. The language here is really no different from what we find in Genesis 25 through 26, where the births of Esau and Jacob are narrated. See the text here. And the first came out red, Vayetze harishon admoni. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment. And they called his name Esau. And after this his brother came out, Yatsa Achiv. And his hand grasped Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. Notice in these verses the use of the verb yatsa, to go out. Evidently, this was just the normal way of speaking about parturition. So in Exodus 21:22, where that same verb, yatsa, is used, and there's no further specification about the children dying, there's no reason to assume that the children are coming out of the woman dead. I would argue that the text can be better understood as speaking about a normal term birth, or perhaps, given the context, a premature birth, but not a miscarriage. Although I do think that the issue of miscarriage is addressed in verse 23 with the reference to further harm and the invoking of the life for life principle. Now, many would refer to this text in Exodus 21 as a case law. The law of Moses contains many such laws, especially in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. They describe certain scenarios and then offer a judgment as to how they ought to be handled. Often they're written up as if-then statements. We shouldn't think of these laws as purely hypothetical. They seem to be the codification of rulings that were made in response to real-life situations that had taken place within the society and needed to be addressed. So in order to understand the text in Exodus 21, it may be helpful to imagine what sort of real-life situation might have given rise to this particular case law. It's possible that as two men were fighting, a pregnant woman got involved in the situation, perhaps because she was trying to break up the fight. When she did this, she got hit because she was perceived as being in the way, or maybe because she was the wife of one of the two men, and striking her was a way to inflict suffering on her husband indirectly. Either way, the woman subsequently gave birth, and I think probably prematurely. This is really the most that can be inferred from the language. As I said, there's no term for miscarriage used in this verse, and there's no suggestion, at least in verse 22, that the children actually die. We're simply told that they go out from the woman. And again, this is just the language of parturition. Next, we're told that if no further harm results, a penalty was to be imposed upon the assailant. But, in verse 23, we're told that if there is any further harm, quote, "You shall give life for life." Now, on Dan's view, the harm here would have to refer to the woman, since the child is already dead. But in that case, we would expect verse 22 to read, "Velo yiyeh ason la," and there is no harm to her. And likewise in verse 23, ve'im ason la yiyeh, and if there is harm to her. We don't get that in the Hebrew text. We're not told that it's the woman who experiences this harm. In fact, the syntax suggests that this harm is something that the children experience. I say that because the last verbal subject before the mention of this harm is not the woman, but the children. Moreover, there would have been no reason to single out pregnant women and to explain that, yes, talionic justice applies to them too, should they be violently struck and injured or killed. Are we to imagine that some people didn't understand that pregnant women are no less human beings than non-pregnant women? As if being pregnant meant that you didn't qualify as a human being anymore? That's kind of what we would have to infer if Dan's view is correct. After all, the punishment for inflicting bodily harm on any woman would have already been covered under the general rubric of talionic justice. There would have been no need to explain that talionic justice applies to pregnant women specifically if it was already understood that talionic justice applies to all women. So I understand the harm here to be something that the children either experience or don't experience as a result of the blow to the woman's body. Now, I should probably point out that the term harm, ason in Hebrew, is a little bit ambiguous and could probably be translated just as well as something bad, calamity, or misfortune. Despite the Targum renderings, the term doesn't specifically mean death. It's vague enough to cover a pretty wide range of negative eventualities. And some of those eventualities will be alluded to in verses 24 through 25. The man would be punished in proportion to the amount of harm, or whatever you want to call it, that he has inflicted either on the woman or the children, depending on whether we are going with Dan's or my interpretation. And remember, this isn't just my personal interpretation. This is one that is espoused by many commentators. But on my interpretation, verse 22 would refer to a birth in which the children survive and sustain no injuries. And verse 23 would refer to a birth in which the children do not survive. And then verses 24 and 25 refer to a birth in which some kind of injury is sustained by the baby. Maybe the baby is born blind, or lame, or can't hear, or is crippled in some other way. In the first scenario, the assailant would have to pay a fine. In the second, the man would be punished with death, or some other, less severe form of corporal punishment that corresponded to the kind of non-fatal injuries that were sustained by the babies on account of the man's violent action. And this, contra Dan McClellan, implies that unborn children were afforded the same legal standing as any other human beings. Dan's claim that in ancient Israel, unborn babies were regarded as mere property and not as human persons would therefore have to be rejected as exegetically misguided. A few other problems in Dan's video that might be worth mentioning are his remarks about various texts of the Bible having no bearing on the issue of whether an unborn child was regarded as a person. I think that Psalm 139, for example, is pretty clear that the unborn child was not envisaged as, an impersonal clump of cells or anything like that. Notice how the psalmist uses the personal pronouns I, my, and me. This suggests that he didn't feel any need to distance himself from his unborn body or his fetus. He doesn't say, for example, "You have formed the inward parts that would soon become mine, or would soon become a part of me." He identifies those inward parts as his own, just as you might talk about your heart or your stomach. You talk that way because you recognize these organs as being part of you, the person. They're not things outside of you that you would talk about as if they were separate things. You identify them as part of your own being. Again, he doesn't say, "You knit a body together in my mother's womb, and once I was born, I got to possess that body as my own." Or, "Your eyes beheld the unformed substance that would one day become me." Rather, he identifies himself with and as the unborn body and the unformed substance in his mother's womb. Okay, and then I also don't think that Luke chapter 1 is so irrelevant to this topic, as Dan claims. We're told in verse 15 of this chapter that John the Baptist would be filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb. Does this not imply that John was a human being or a person? I think it does. Then we're told in verses 41 through 44 that after Mary conceived Jesus, she went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was herself pregnant with John the Baptist. As soon as Elizabeth heard Mary's voice, the yet unborn John leaped for joy in his mother's womb. This implies some kind of consciousness and sensitivity to what God was doing in Mary. Also, if the gospel writer Luke had believed, as Dan McClellan does, about the non-personhood of the baby, we might have expected Elizabeth not to say that the brephos, or baby, in the womb had leaped for joy, but something like, "The growing mass in my belly," or "the unformed substance in my belly," leaped or moved. Secondly, Dan suggests that until the 4th century, Christians were very much divided about whether the unborn child should be regarded as a human being. It would have been nice if he had offered some documentation from primary sources to back up this claim. I am aware that Augustine believed that life happens at the quickening, that is, when the baby is first felt to move, something, by the way, that happens quite early, within at least the first trimester. But I don't know that Augustine represented a widely held view, at least not in the first 4 centuries, as Dan suggests. Augustine, in any case, got the idea from Aristotle, not the Bible. It's quite interesting, though, that through both the influence of Aristotle and the Septuagint rendering of Exodus 21:22 through 23, later Christians in the Middle Ages, and even up to the 19th century in Roman Catholicism, would come to believe that life begins when the baby exhibits quickening. Anyway, Dan goes on to assert that in the 4th century, when Christians finally came to believe that the unborn were indeed human beings, they were departing from what was by now the established view in Rabbinic Judaism. More than that, they were departing from what had been taught in their own Bible, because, that text in Exodus 21 so clearly teaches that the unborn are mere property and not human beings or persons. Yeah.